Lucy, hand out the secret ballot.
I don't understand the reference. Sorry.
What?
What's that reference?
Oh my gosh, Charlie Brown. Peanuts.
I didn't watch a lot of Charlie Brown growing up.
Peanuts. They always when they voted, she always said Lucy hand or Marcy. Sorry, Marcy hand because Lucy was doing it. She'd say Marcy hand out the secret ballots.
You're listening to the Janchi Show, hosted by 3 Korean American adoptees diving headfirst into what it means to be adopted, Korean American, and more. And now, here's your hosts, Nathan, Patrick, and KJ.
Alrighty. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Janchi Show. It's your boys, KJ, Nathan, Patrick, here with another fantastic episode. Fellas, how are you doing?
Thank you, KJ. Great.
I'm doing thumbs up.
Got that Yeah, that wordless I get that. Well, yeah, this is a podcast for adoptees, transracial adoptees by Korean adoptees. We typically do interviews or solos, and this week we have an interview, part 1 of 2. Before we get too far into it, Patrick, why don't you tell our listeners what Janchi means and why we call ourselves the Janchi Show?
Absolutely. Janchi means to feast in Korean, in the Korean language. And what we do here on the show is we talk about what it means to live that Korean adoptee life. And also at the end of the show, we do a little feasting and or snacking and or drinking of some sort of item, generally from Korea. Not all the time, though.
Hopefully not expired.
Yeah, and hopefully not expired. Generally expired. I'll say generally.
Generally, come on.
I mean, if you were to look back on the history, I'd say it's like 1/3 of the time. There's a 33% chance it's expired.
I wasn't even going to go that high.
Yeah.
It's like maybe 1/4. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, but that's what we do. We have a really fun one for this show too. Not to get too far into anything, but yeah, super excited to be feasting on this episode and to share that with y'all. So that's the show. Bye.
Yeah. I actually don't have a lot to say in terms of transition for this episode. So
great.
Yeah. Happy June.
Happy June.
Happy
Pride.
Actually,
Happy June Pride Month.
You know what? Last Monday was Loving Day. Happy Loving Day to all of you interracial couples out there. That's a really important day in American history that no one told me about. But without it, like Sarah and I couldn't be married. So it's a big deal. So happy Loving Day to all of our American-based interracial couples. This week, we have a fantastic interview with Mary Bowers, who called in all the way from Korea. So it's always a trick trying to get 4 time zones to line up, especially when one of them is international. But Mary kind of blew me away with her story and her thoughtfulness. And it was just like one of those episodes where I was like, man, this is good. And I wish I didn't have to ask questions because I'm busy just like sitting and thinking. But I'm so excited for y'all to listen to it, to hear her story. And then, like I said before, we've got part 2 coming out next week where we get into a proper food section and more about what is going on with her because she's got some unique story things that are unlike any other guest we've ever had on the show, which is super exciting. And we also eat a food that is unlike anything we've ever had on the show.
Yes.
But you'll have to wait for next week for that. For this week, here is our interview with Mary Bowers.
Welcome back to the Janchi Show. Today it is interview time with our special guest all the way from Korea, Mary Bowers. Thank you for joining us, Mary.
Hi, Mary.
Hi. I'm glad to be here.
And especially with the time difference too. So thank you for being available. I know it was probably a little bit tough. I don't know. It's the morning there, correct? So
yeah. So the way I like to touch base with family and friends back in the States is to tell them that their happy hour or dinner time is my breakfast or brunch time. And so kind of works out because we always have good food and sometimes drinks. I start my day with day drinking.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
It's 5
when you're
o'clock
15
somewhere.
hours apart.
5 o'clock back in LA.
Exactly. It's happy hour, so you're partaking in the happy hour.
Exactly.
Well, again, we appreciate it. We start our show like we always do with you telling us as much or as little of your story as you'd like. So if you want to go ahead, go ahead.
All right, so I'm Mary Bowers, maybe, I think. And I was estimated at 5 months old when I was adopted from Korea to the US. Grew up in Colorado. And when people hear that, they're like, oh, you're so lucky. It's so cool. You must have been skiing all the time. No, I grew up in the flat half of the state that everybody forgets about. So lots of cows, lots of corn.
Some tornadoes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's practically
It
Nebraska.
does not feel like Colorado.
It does not feel like what people usually think of. I do not like snowboarding or skiing because I get cold. I overcorrected for the weather and went to Arizona State University for a couple of years before I decided I did not like when the monsoon collided with the dust storm and rained mud into all of the swimming pools. So then I...
Gross.
Yeah, it was amazing. Like, I didn't even know they could do that. It rained mud and it was, maybe 100-something degrees outside. It was...
Yeah. Oh,
it
yeah,
was
and then
awesome.
everybody has a pool. So, yeah, all the pools are ruined. Ugh.
Yeah, imagine
it was
maintaining that. Pool cleaning
even...
service, money.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Like, you can't even just drain the pool because it's all mud. So
Right.
At that point I went to California and got my degree in architecture and engineering. So
With growing up, how big was the town that you grew up in Colorado? Was it?
Okay, so it felt like a small town to me because you're when you're surrounded by cornfields, it inevitably is going to feel small. So, but there were about 40,000 people when I lived there. I think maybe it's around 60 or 70,000 now. So a small city, but I think there's always been like a sense of community there, so it still has that small town feel to it. I think the challenge with that community, though, is when you are the only person who looks like you, and the people around you who maybe do look like you are also adopted, trying to figure out how to navigate the world. It becomes a bit of a challenge in figuring out, well, how do I fit in here? But I don't know if I'll ever even have the answer to that question.
Did you have some other acquaintances or friends that were adopted?
So there were a few people. I think unfortunately, like the most well-known adoption case from Greeley, Colorado, was one where there was a Russian baby who had been adopted. He was abused by his adoptive parents, and it was the very first court case where attachment disorder was used as a defense in the case. So that would be, I guess, Greeley's unfortunate, infamous fame to claim with adoption. So got dark real fast. But no, it's kind of weird because when people look at me, I don't think they understand, because I think when they see me, they're like, oh yeah, definitely fits. They see I think there's a place where you are raised and there is a place where you grow up. And so they see the growing up that happened in California, like that point where, I kind of moved out on my own, figured out what I wanted to do with my life. They see that piece of me. But then I start talking about like rodeos and mutton busting, and they're like, what? Where's this coming from? So, it's I think a surprise to people.
How did you find yourself navigating this place that you were raised, the person that the influence that had on you, then going to California and being that place that where you grew up? How did you navigate both of those at the same time as trying to, I guess, maybe understand yourself as maybe Asian American or as adopted, or however that journey played out for you?
I think my very first memories of race were probably around preschool age. So I think I was very aware of that difference when I was really, really young. I remember the first day of preschool, I was so excited. My parents got me so hyped up, like ready to go. Like, you're going to play with all the other kids. You're going to make all of these friends. And I got there, and I don't even remember entirely what happened, but there was a point during the day where I started crying at school and did not stop until like well after I got home. And I remember saying to my parents, like, I want the blonde hair. I want the blue eyes.
Ugh.
Damn.
And I think part of it too was like, I realized that the dolls that everybody was playing with, all the other little girls were playing with, looked like them. And yet mine didn't look anything like me. So I was very aware of that. And then I think at a certain point, it's like you just learn that it makes other people uncomfortable to talk about. I remember my parents kind of sitting me down, and they're like, well, we love you. We think you're beautiful, so it doesn't matter. But I don't think it really gave me the tools to actually address like all of those feelings. It was kind of like the Band-Aid on the bullet hole.
Right.
And so I just kind of suppressed a lot of that. And by the time I got to high school, college, I remember questioning, should I even apply for Asian American scholarships to college? And
oh my God, I didn't even think about doing that. What the heck?
I didn't even think of, I wouldn't even have thought that those existed. If you
and then the question was, well, if they see my last name on the application, are they just going to throw it aside and be like, there's somebody who's trying to scam the system? Like, am I even going to, should I even apply? And I think that that's one of the things about identity that people don't realize. I mean, that's something that has a real world, like, lasting impact that has, implications for your education, for your finances. Like, it's not just how I feel inside. There is that feeling and how it gets conveyed and how it plays out in the real world.
Yeah. So one of the things that we talk about on the show a lot, and in our own trajectory of interviewing other adoptees and things, is like that idea of self-racialization. And so, I mean, it sucks that you felt the sense of like otherness as early as preschool, and sometimes that doesn't always lead to how we think of ourselves now in adulthood. After usually, if people are coming on the show, they've gone through some version of like, I am adopted, and that is an identity that I hold and one that I actively think about. And I'm Asian American, I'm Korean American, whatever. And it sounds like even just in what you said, you were raised fairly colorblind, just in a general sense of like, well, we don't see color. We just love you and you're our daughter, and all that stuff, which is great and wonderful. And like you said, it does have some real world consequences because you have to navigate things that you just can't explain really. What was the moment where you first really began to think of yourself as an adoptee, and like what caused that
I would
change?
say the race thing is part of that too, because it's not like you can hide that your kid is a different race. And the questions from other people, there's that sense of otherism. So my parents had to explain very early on what their perception of adoption was. A lot of that was filtered through kind of what they were told by the adoption agency, what they were told by other adoptive parents. But I don't think at that point, just because of the numbers of how the cycles and Korean adoptions worked, that they had the resources of asking like grown adoptees. And so I would say, like, for adoptive parents now, I think that's a really wonderful thing. Like, we've all grown up, we've gone through this process, they can ask us. But I don't think that was really available for my family. And so I acknowledge, like, yeah, there were a lot of really messed up things, but they also were doing the best they could with what they had to work with. So I think, I mean, it's just always been something that I've known. To be able to, like, to feel like I could claim it, though, I think that's just kind of an ongoing process, because it's not just me saying, like, I'm an adoptee. It's also like the response of the world around me. So even though I think a lot of adoptees have been claiming their identities for years and years, the response is a little bit strange, because sometimes it's like this mythical figure, like, oh, you're so lucky, you must have superpowers. I mean, you look at figures like Superman or like, let me think,
Harry Potter, maybe.
Buddy the Elf was one that I was just thinking of
that's
a little bit
one.
earlier today.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard to live up to some of those identities, and I'm not sure that I will ever really fully resolve what it means. I think it's an ongoing process, and part of that just goes with, like, your natural life cycle. I think the issues are different depending on your age, your experience. But I would say when I was a kid, like, I just didn't have the language or the experience to express how I felt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, I like that you name it as an ongoing process, and it's like an evolution. And obviously when we have people share their stories, like, it's so different every single time. There might be some similar beats, but it's so different for everyone how they come to that. Did you find yourself at a certain point starting to think and talk differently about adoption and your specific experience? Or was that just part of that thing that kind of came about?
Okay, so I would say there were a couple of things that's like you get. I have sort of this weird relationship with the mythical figures in those stories. So there's always, as part of the hero's journey, there's like that resistance, like, I'm going to totally reject this piece of me, this piece of my identity. And then you kind of just come back and claim it.
Patrick has entered the chat.
Yeah.
I'm going to totally reject this piece of my identity. Okay, bye.
Yeah. So after I finished university, I went to work for several government agencies. And I was also a consultant for the Department of Homeland Security for several years. And I really, really loved that experience. I really enjoyed that experience until the family separation policy kind of went into effect. And that was something that, I think on a human level, I probably would not have wanted to support, family separation to begin with. But the way that it hit, it struck more like a memory as all of that was playing out. So that was kind of like my big, like, life just comes crashing down trauma. Like, I don't even know what the hell is happening, but this doesn't just feel wrong, it feels familiar. And then kind of struggled for about a year, and then COVID happened. And I did not have to worry about social distancing, because people were suddenly pulling their children away from me in the grocery store. Right. And I had this realization of all of that privilege that I had from being adjacent to my white family, my white parents, was not my privilege. Mm-hmm. It was theirs. And I just received the benefit by association. And so I think the combination of those two events kind of set me on this trajectory. That was the point where I was like, okay, well, things are getting interesting and getting a little spicier than I like in the States. So I would like to go somewhere. And at that point, nobody was taking American passports. So I was like, I can go back to Korea. And so I was like, while I'm there, I might as well just do a birth search while I'm there. But I mean, initially that wasn't even the intent for coming back. I mean, it was more of like a kind of fight flight avoidance in my case, and it's always been at the back of my mind. But this idea of like naively, I'm just going to do birth search while I'm there. I did not realize. And had I realized at that point how much goes into that process and the emotional labor that goes with it, I don't think I would have started. I think if somebody had told me what it would entail, I don't know if I would have been brave enough to do it. Which I was not brave, and I was not brave at all. Like, I cried. The only thing that stopped me from crying on the flight to Seoul was that we were required to wear masks on the plane, and I did not just want to have a snot-filled mask on my face for the whole 14-hour flight. So
I really appreciate you sharing that, and definitely want to get into that part. But I want to name something that you just said really quickly, because I literally just had this exact conversation twice the other day. You talked about how you realized when people were pulling their kids away from you that shield of love or whatever it is, like that our adoptive parents place over us, like that doesn't protect us from that. And also that this privilege that we hold, like we are given that, and it can just as easily be taken away. Like we don't, and I don't think we name that enough, because at the end of the day, we are not white, and we do not carry that exact privilege. We carry the proximity to it. And we're told, and it's reaffirmed to us over and over and over again by our adoptive families, by our communities, by the environment, that love is enough. Love will overcome. I don't know if that's the thing from a movie, but it feels like it.
We don't see you as different.
Exactly.
You belong with us.
And it becomes so foundational, and we're made to believe that will always be there, and we'll be protected by that. And so whether or not we lean into our identity or don't, then it's like, okay, we'll be fine. But that's not true, because at the end of the day, that privilege can be taken away just as easily as it was given to us when we were adopted. So I just wanted to name that, because that's a really important point that we don't talk about.
Like, I remember being in the store, and the first time it happened, I had the exact thought. I was like, I guess I'm not white anymore.
Damn.
Yeah. I had a similar moment at the same time as COVID. And I had the question of, does Sarah does my wife go to the grocery store to get groceries and risk her life, risk potentially getting COVID? Do I do that and also not only risk my life to COVID, but also risk myself to being that exact same thing of like, are people going to be mean at me, basically? For whatever that means. And I was living in Missouri at the time, in a town that was a little larger than the ones you grew up in, but and it was the same kind of thing. And that was a moment for me where I was like, this is terrible. And I felt like that just coming out of the fog, the protective shroud of my white parents, it's being like, this is awful. So totally, absolutely resonate with that.
I've definitely felt that same thing, only for my kids. So, and watching them, go around in spaces and think if anyone's, looking at them in a way that, like that, and is there any way I can protect them from that, or keep them out of we kept them out of daycare for a really long time because we were worried that people would treat them differently, and also because we didn't want them to get sick. But so there's always that thing in the back of my mind when I would take them out. And we even one time did get confronted by a guy at a mall one time, and this was when things were starting to open up a little more. But my kids, all of us were wearing masks, and of course, it's an outdoor mall. We're still wearing masks, walking around the mall. And some white guy came up to us and said, "Your kids shouldn't be wearing those masks. They don't even really get it anyway." And this was back when when the cases for kids was very low, and so he was, trying to give me his opinion and what I should do and how I should raise my kids. And of course, in a way, I felt I was getting targeted because I was other people were wearing masks, but for some reason he targeted me, and I just said thank you and moved on. I didn't want to interact.
I feel like the mask conversation was very different for Asians during the pandemic than for other groups of people, because the first realization that I realized, like when I realized that COVID was going to be a thing, I was in Romania at the airport, and this was maybe late January, early February of 2020. And there was a Japanese guy who walked up to me and he was like, "Why aren't you wearing a mask? Don't you know what's happening in China?" And I mean, at that point, like nobody had shut down their economy. Nobody, it hadn't even been officially declared a pandemic. But he seemed really concerned. And I was like, "Thanks for your concern, but like, you're the only one here who's wearing a mask." And he said, no, I don't think you understand. It's different for you because this is coming from China. People might see your face and try to hurt you. So his thinking was not about virus at all at that point. And that was kind of the, oh my God, moment of I don't even know what to say. Like those moments just take your breath away. But I mean, I'm really grateful that he said something, but it did give me a very different mindset on how to approach my interactions with the world through that time frame.
Well, and that's so interesting too, because I remember when the mask thing started happening, I was like, in my head, I was like, oh yeah, Koreans and Japanese and Chinese people, like they got the mask thing down. Like no worries. They're like all used to this, whatever. And so like I'm seeing like half of America complain about wearing masks and worrying about like suffocating from the lack of oxygen that they would receive, whatever. And I was like, I felt more Asian by wearing a mask, and then also like way more Asian, not in a good way for wearing a mask, which I think is rough. So yeah, it was just, man, what a weird time. So I don't understand how, like, why you were in Romania, but I'm actually more curious about, this is very funny.
I was literally there. I was there to eat cupcakes.
Amazing. Hey. Okay. So world traveling for food and things, but I'm curious. So you decide to go to Korea. How did you feel about Korea and being Korean at the time? Like I grew up very aware of being Korean and really loved being Korean. For a lot of other adoptees, Korean adoptees, they have mixed feelings about being Korean or being like thinking about like the country. What was your thought, your headspace going back, besides just like, I just need to get out of America and this place will take me?
I think for me it was difficult because there's a lot of self-hatred there. Like you learn that it makes people uncomfortable to talk about or acknowledge. So then by extension, it became, okay, well, that part of me is not acceptable. The Korean me is not acceptable. So therefore, Korea is not acceptable. I had, like, I would say the relationship with my adoptive family at that point too was not great. My adoptive mom reacted pretty harshly when I told her that I was returning to Korea. I mean, to the point where it was like, okay, have a nice life, and then hung up the phone and we didn't talk to each other for several months. She's had her own process and has definitely come around. But it's taken a lot. And so to realize that I don't have that family support, I'm doing this on my own. I sold all of my stuff, by the way, too. Like everything that I owned that was not like photographs, sentimental stuff. Like I sold all of it to come because it was important for whatever reason to be here. And the way that I would explain it, like I've been really fascinated with animals who return to their birthplace, because at the end of the day, humans are also animals. We're part of nature too. And so it's usually like aquatic animals like penguins,
I was gonna say, like
or
salmon,
like salmon, sea turtles. I think elephants are the land animal exception. And generally, there's 3 reasons that animals return home. And one is to give birth. Another is to die. I am hoping that the second one is definitely not true. I don't have plans of giving birth anytime soon either. That would be a surprise. But the third reason is under acute stress. And I think global pandemic, everything that went with the pandemic that was happening, not just in the States, but worldwide, I think that's definitely like, it counts as acute stress. And the reason that animals
was that
return,
stressful for you? Interesting.
Yeah. Oh no, like I think when I'm super old, I'll just explain to all the kids. I'll be like, yeah, there was just one day when everybody in the world decided to stop going to work, and we all decided
everyone
like
took
we're
a
just
nap
gonna
for 2 years.
We're gonna stay home for 2 years and bake bread, watch crappy TV.
It was so chill.
Yeah. Yeah. So the acute stress, the reason animals do this is because if a location was, I guess, if the location that they were born had the resources to support life in the first place, they instinctually return to that same place because they know that the resources are there.
Yeah.
And I would say that that has been like very much my experience with Korea.
And what led you to executing your birth search? Which, because you said you was like, I'm just going to do a birth search. It's just like, you know, like going into it like that. Like, what led to that? Which eventually, I think, put you on this path to what we're going to talk about, which would be what's going on currently.
I think honestly, it was a combination of buying into the prevailing narrative of what adoption is. I think there's also the reunion stories that we're exposed to.
Right.
They're put through a certain filter, a certain lens. And the problem with those stories is not that the reunions happen. It's that that's perceived as an ending when it's like, that's like the middle of the story.
It's like, we did it. And then that's the credits roll. And that's all we got.
Yeah, but that's not what it is. So one of my friends who is in reunion, she's one of my closest friends. Right before I left for Korea, I actually met her sister for the first time. And I was like, what do I need to know? And she said to me, well, just know, like, part of what that is learning to be a family. So that doesn't just apply to like our biological families. It applies to our adoptive families, or, you know, for adoptees that have children, that applies to their children. It's like you have to go through a process through search and also reunion, which I'm still looking. There's a process of like even just defining what family is. And I think the problem, and it's not just adoptees who run into this, but I would say like the LGBTQ community also runs into this, is that the way the parameters for what counts as a family are way too narrow. And there's people like that model clearly doesn't work for everybody.
So how did you go about redefining that for yourself in that process? Or is that something that is ongoing, I guess? It's probably an ongoing process of like figuring out what that is.
Definitely ongoing. I was thinking, you know, that family tree project that we're all assigned in elementary school, and it's so painful and awful for adoptees. And I'm like, I don't even know how I'm supposed to. I don't have people to put on my tree, and then you put it on your tree and you're like, that feels like I'm just imagining things. The way I've started explaining, I'm like, it's more like a tumbleweed in my case. Like, like if I had the awareness as a small child, I would have just taken a crayon, scribbled it on the paper, and been like, done. And I would have had like, you know, I think the teacher would have been annoyed, but I'd be like, this is my family, tumbleweed.
This is my family.
I've not heard that descriptor before. But I kind of like
it's like a tangled, it's just like a tangled blobby mess but then like
it literally
glows,
grows
like,
as it travels. Like
Right.
it grows
it's
as
such
it
a great
travels,
metaphor
and it goes
for
everywhere.
chosen family. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not just like chosen family, but it leaves it's like part of the reason they're a pain in the ass is because they leave the seed everywhere that it goes.
Oh,
So
yeah,
it like
it's true.
it grows
Yeah.
more
Scratches your
as it
car up when you
travels.
run over it.
Oh, please don't run over me.
Jeez. Don't run over the tumbleweeds, Nathan.
Oh man.
Nathan is like, Allison gets mad whenever I swerve to try to hit them. And I always forget.
Because when you hit them, they explode. No, it's not. I do try to avoid them.
Thanks again for listening to part 1 of our conversation with Mary Bowers. Lots to process for sure. And again, thank you to Mary for calling in from Korea and sharing so much of her story. Tune in next week for part 2, where we're going to dive into a little bit more of the birth search process. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how all of this ties into her competitive eating career. So we have some links in the show notes. Make sure you check those out. And as always, you can find us at Janchi Show on all the social media platforms. You can write us and leave us a message via email by sending that to janchishow@gmail.com. You can also leave us a message at 972-677-8867. If you feel like supporting the show and you want to find out how to do so, visit us at our website, janchishow.com. And if you like what you hear each Wednesday and you want to leave us a review on whatever podcast player you're currently listening to this on, we would greatly appreciate that as well. Last but not least, you can find me at Patrick in the World, KJ at KJ Relke, and Nathan at N Nowak on the interwebs, wherever we want to be found. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next week for part 2 of our conversation with Mary Bowers. Until then, Janchi, heyo!